In the spring of 1942, America was still reeling. Pearl Harbor's wrecked battleships sat half-submerged like tombstones in the Pacific, a constant reminder of how vulnerable the nation had been caught. Newspapers carried grim headlines from the Philippines, Java, and Singapore, territories falling one after another as Japan's empire surged outward. On the streets of American cities, people queued for ration stamps, scanned casualty lists, and listened to Roosevelt's speeches for any sign of hope. The promise of revenge echoed everywhere, but no one knew when or how that first blow would fall. Inside the White House, the pressure on Roosevelt was immense. The public demanded action, the military needed a morale victory, and allies doubted if the United States could strike back anytime soon. Japan's cities and industrial centers were far beyond the reach of American bombers. Every map seemed to mock the idea of retaliation. Yet, in that atmosphere of uncertainty, a plan began to form, one so audacious it bordered on impossible. A small group of officers believed America could hit Japan much sooner than anyone expected. They lacked the aircraft, the range, and the precedent. But they had determination, and they had one man whose mind thrived on the unlikely. Lieutenant Colonel James Harold Doolittle. The idea surfaced in January 1942 in a quiet office deep inside the Navy Department. Captain Francis Lowe suggested it first. What if Army bombers could launch from an aircraft carrier? It sounded absurd. No medium bomber had ever taken off from a carrier deck, let alone with a full load of fuel and bombs. But the thought electrified the few who heard it. If it worked, America could strike Japan's home islands months, perhaps years, before Japan thought it was possible. James Doolittle, already a legend for his record-setting flights and fearless innovations, was given the mission. He studied aircraft performance charts, fuel consumption rates, and carrier deck dimensions. The numbers argued against success. The risks were enormous. The bombers couldn't land on a carrier, so crews would have to fly on toward China after the attack, ditching or crash landing in unknown terrain. Navigational errors, weather, or a Japanese patrol could doom the entire mission. Yet the plan moved forward. Volunteers were quietly gathered from bomber groups across the country, told only that they were being selected for a dangerous and secret mission. They trained on short runways that simulated a carrier deck, practicing takeoffs that pushed the limits of physics. Mechanics stripped weight from engines and fuselages, coaxing every mile of range from the B-25 Mitchell bombers. Slowly, impossibility shifted into the realm of the daring possible. In late March 1942, 16 modified B-25s were hoisted onto the deck of the USS Hornet in Alameda, California. Civilian workers and sailors watched in stunned silence. The bombers looked enormous on the carrier's narrow flight deck, their wings stretching perilously close to the edge. The crews carried maps of Japan, silk escape charts, concentrated rations, and sealed orders they were forbidden to open. As the Hornet steamed westward into the Pacific, the mood shifted from excitement to tension. The bomber crews lived in cramped quarters below decks, their aircraft lashed and secured against the rolling sea. They studied Japanese urban layouts, anti-aircraft positions, and escape routes into China. Above them, Navy personnel prepared the carrier for the most unusual mission in its history. Word spread among the fleet, and rumors circulated, "We're going to bomb Tokyo." No one knew if they would even get close. Midway across the Pacific, the Hornet rendezvoused with Admiral Halsey's task force, cruisers, destroyers, and the carrier Enterprise. Together, the armada pushed deeper into enemy waters. Every mile made discovery more likely. Every hour brought them closer to the point of no return. The men understood that once they launched, there would be no coming back. On the morning of April 18th, 1942, before dawn had fully lifted, the task force encountered a Japanese picket boat, a tiny silhouette on the waves, but capable of transmitting radio warnings. The Americans opened fire, sinking it, but not quickly enough. The alarm had almost certainly gone out. Doolittle faced a brutal choice: launch immediately, hundreds of miles farther from Japan than planned, or turn back and abandon the mission entirely. He didn't hesitate. "We go now." The bombers were fueled to their limits. The sea was rough, the wind uncertain. The carriers pitched with each swell, making the narrow deck an unforgiving runway. One by one, the 16 B-25s roared forward, engines screaming, wheels leaving the deck with feet to spare. Sailors watched each takeoff with held breath, knowing that even a small mistake could send the aircraft plunging into the waves. Once airborne, the raid was finally underway. The bombers climbed into formation, pointed toward Japan, and disappeared over the horizon. Behind them, the American carriers turned and sped eastward at flank speed. They had done their part. Now everything depended on Doolittle and his men. Hours later, the Japanese coast came into view through scattered clouds. Factories, shipyards, rail lines, and tightly packed neighborhoods stretched beneath the bombers. Air raid sirens wailed as Japanese spotters realized the unthinkable was happening. American aircraft were approaching Tokyo, and no one knew how they had gotten there. Doolittle went first, his bomber sweeping low over industrial districts before releasing its bombs. Explosions rippled across factories producing aircraft parts and military equipment. Other crews struck targets in Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe. Anti-aircraft fire erupted from rooftops, sending black puffs into the sky, but the B-25s flew too fast and too low for most gunners to track effectively. Japanese fighters scrambled, but by the time they reached altitude, the raiders were already racing westward, disappearing into the haze. The physical damage was limited, but the psychological impact was enormous. Japan's leaders, stunned that American aircraft had reached the capital, immediately began questioning their defenses. Across the Pacific, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans felt a surge of pride and hope. The Doolittle Raid did what no battleship or bomber group had yet done. It proved Japan was not untouchable. After leaving Japan's coastline behind, the Doolittle Raiders faced their most dangerous opponent yet: distance. They had launched more than 150 miles earlier than planned. Every fuel gauge told the same story: there would not be enough to reach the designated airfields in China. Winds shifted, visibility worsened, and rain clouds thickened on the horizon. The bomber crews tightened their belts and recalculated headings, hoping the storms might at least help them evade Japanese patrols. Inside the cramped cockpits, pilots nursed engines, reducing throttle settings to squeeze out every remaining mile. Some men tossed extra equipment out the hatch: machine guns, radios, spent casings, anything to lighten the aircraft. Hunger, fatigue, and the relentless droning of engines gnawed at their nerves. Yet no one turned back. They had already struck Tokyo. Now survival was the only goal. Radio silence blanketed the airwaves, each crew isolated in their own metal world as darkness gathered over the East China Sea. Night had fully fallen by the time the raiders approached the Chinese coast. Sheets of rain hammered their canopies, and lightning flared against the mountains. Fuel needles hovered near empty. Some planes skimmed the treetops, their engines sputtering. Doolittle ordered his crew to prepare for bailout. One by one, the bombers crossed into Chinese airspace, and then their engines finally starved. Parachutes snapped open in the darkness as crews abandoned their aircraft over rugged hills and flooded fields. The land below was a patchwork of farms, villages, and wartime chaos. Farmers rushed out with lanterns, hearing the strange roar overhead. Some raiders crashed hard, injuring limbs as they hit uneven ground. Others drifted into rivers or dense bamboo. Despite the chaos, many were found by Chinese civilians who risked their lives to help them escape Japanese patrols. In the black night, wounded and exhausted, the raiders began the second ordeal of their mission: survival behind enemy lines. Japan reacted swiftly. Infuriated by the humiliation of being bombed, its commanders launched brutal reprisals across eastern China. Entire towns suspected of aiding the raiders were burned, their populations massacred. Villagers who had given food, shelter, or directions paid with their lives. Chinese resistance fighters tried desperately to move the raiders westward, deeper into nationalist territory, hiding them in barns, caves, and monasteries. For the American crews, the magnitude of the sacrifice made for them was overwhelming. They saw families torn apart, villages in ashes, and civilians executed for kindness shown to strangers. Many raiders later spoke of this part of the mission with heaviness that lasted for decades. The triumph of striking Tokyo now came shadowed by the terrible price paid by those who had never fired a shot. Not all the raiders escaped. Several crews landed off course or crashed near Japanese positions. 8 men were taken prisoner, dragged through interrogations, and paraded as criminals. Tokyo demanded vengeance. 3 were executed after a show trial. Another died from disease in captivity. The remaining 4 endured years of starvation, beatings, and solitary confinement. They faded into forgotten cells as the war raged on. For the American military, these losses were painful reminders of the raid's risks. Yet even in captivity, the surviving airmen held fast to the hope that their sacrifice had mattered. And it had. Their mission, small in scale, had shaken an empire and forced Japan to redirect troops and aircraft away from the front lines, toward defending a homeland they believed was beyond reach. Back in the United States, the Doolittle Raiders became instant legends. Newspapers splashed their story across front pages, and radio broadcasts painted them as the first men to strike the Japanese mainland. The nation, still bruised from early defeats, felt a surge of hope and pride. Roosevelt praised the raid as a sign that America could and would take the fight across the world. Doolittle himself believed he would be court-martialed for losing all 16 bombers. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor. His men earned decorations and promotions. But behind the parades and applause, the raiders carried memories of the night storms, the crashes, the Chinese villagers who saved them, and the comrades who never came home. The mission had lasted only a single day, but its impact would echo across the entire war. For Japan, the Doolittle Raid was far more than a symbolic embarrassment. It was a strategic shockwave. American bombers had reached the capital itself. If 16 B-25s could appear over Tokyo, what might come next? Panic rippled through military headquarters as commanders debated how such an attack had been possible. Fingers pointed in every direction: naval patrol failures, radar blind spots, broken communication lines. The Imperial Navy's prestige, still gleaming from the victories of 1941, suffered a deep, unexpected wound. The humiliation stung, Tokyo's civilians demanded answers, and Japan's leadership sought someone to blame. Beyond the psychological blow, the raid shattered an illusion that Japan had relied on, that its home islands were naturally shielded by vast oceans. The military abruptly shifted resources to reinforce the nation's eastern defenses, planes, ships, and troops that otherwise would have bolstered operations in Burma, New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. In that sense, the raid was more than payback. It altered Japan's strategic trajectory. It planted fear in the heart of an empire that had believed itself untouchable. While the Doolittle Raiders struggled across China, analysts in Washington studied Japan's reaction with keen interest. Intelligence reports showed Japan strengthening its home defenses and diverting reconnaissance aircraft away from distant waters. Naval planners realized that Japan, fearing another American strike, would now guard its eastern approaches with greater urgency. That shift, subtle at first glance, contributed directly to Japan's next major decision: to destroy the U.S. carrier fleet once and for all. Across the Pacific, Admiral Yamamoto moved quickly. The humiliation in Tokyo accelerated his plans for a decisive battle, a bold thrust intended to lure U.S. carriers into the open and annihilate them. That plan would lead directly to a small atoll called Midway. The Doolittle Raid, in its daring simplicity, had helped set the stage for one of the most consequential clashes in naval history. The raiders who survived the trek across China eventually made their way back to American lines, some limping, some wounded, all exhausted. Their clothes were torn from mountain crashes and jungle travel, their faces gaunt from days of hunger and sleepless nights. They carried stories of villagers who had risked everything to shelter them, of Japanese patrols sweeping the countryside, of friends lost along the way. When Doolittle reunited with his men, relief carved through the exhaustion. He had expected disgrace. Instead, his men treated him with a mixture of affection and awe. They had survived the impossible together. Their shared ordeal forged a bond deeper than any medal or newspaper headline could capture. Though the world hailed them as heroes, they knew the real heroes included the Chinese civilians who had suffered in silence. For years, the deeper consequences of the Doolittle Raid remained classified. The public celebrated the daring flight and the symbolic blow, but few knew how profoundly the raid influenced Japan's strategic decisions. Intelligence officers, scanning intercepted messages, noted changes in Japanese fleet deployments. Analysts tracked shifts in fuel allocation, convoy escorts, and air defense priorities. Even the Japanese High Command later admitted that the raid exposed their vulnerability and forced them to fortify the home islands. This shift in priorities weakened Japan's broader war effort, dividing resources between advancing fronts and homeland defense. The raid had been small, but its echoes shaped operations across the Pacific. It accelerated Japan's drive toward the decisive confrontation at Midway and helped transform the psychological landscape of the Pacific War. In the end, the Doolittle Raid was a paradox, tactically minor, strategically enormous. The material damage inflicted on Japan was limited, but the emotional and strategic damage was profound. For Americans, the raid proved that courage and creativity could overcome distance, defeat despair, and strike back against an enemy that seemed invincible. It restored faith at a moment when morale was dangerously low. For Japan, it triggered a chain of reactions that contributed directly to Midway and the unraveling of its offensive momentum. The raid forced Tokyo to defend itself, exposed cracks in military planning, and revealed the dangers of underestimating an opponent driven not by fear, but by determination. The 16 bombers never returned, and many of the men who flew them paid a heavy price. But their mission echoed across continents and years. It became a symbol of resilience, a turning of emotional tides, and a reminder that in war, sometimes, one bold strike can change everything.